Touch the leg and welcome to Tibet this week, where we bring you news on Tibet, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Central Tibetan Administration. Let's have a look at today's headlines. His Holiness the Dalai Lama expresses sadness over earthquake and flooding in Morocco and Libya. His Holiness the Dalai Lama condoles the demise of Zulu leader. Speaker of the Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile calls on to G20 leaders for Tibet. Sikyong Penpa Tsering wraps Dharamshala visit. Kalon inaugurates Book of Essays on Tibetan Buddhist Tradition of Reincarnations. Parliamentary delegation meets Estonian Prime Minister, attends OGP Global Summit 2023. Tibetan Parliamentary delegation concludes Tibet Advocacy in Ladakh. Taiwanese scholars visit Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile. Representative Kama Singey calls on Australian Senator Janet Rice. Representative Dr. Namgyal Choedup attends Inaugural of His Holiness the Dalai Lama Library and Learning Center in Ithaca. Representative Choedup attends Festival of Tibet and the Himalayan people. Japanese monks issued statement urging China to stop human rights violations and religious repression in Tibet. Deputy Salvador Caro visits Office of Tibet, Taiwan. India-Tibet Coordination Office holds conference on Tibet at O.B. Jindal Global University. His Holiness the Dalai Lama expressed his deep sadness over the extensive loss of life and injuries as a result of the devastating earthquake and flooding that has struck Morocco and Libya respectively. His Holiness sent his prayers this week for those who have lost their lives and offers donations towards the rescue and relief efforts as a token of his solidarity with the people of Morocco and Libya respectively. His Holiness the Dalai Lama on Monday this week offered his heartfelt condolences and prayers to the family members and well-wishers of His Excellency Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi of South Africa, who passed away on Saturday last week. His Holiness remembered Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi as a good friend to him and to the Tibetan people, and said that he will remain grateful to the late Prince for his interest and steadfast support for the dignity and freedom of Tibetan people. The Speaker of the Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile, Khenpo Sonam Tenbel, wrote to the leaders of the G20, an intergovernmental forum comprising 19 countries and the European Union, to bring their attention to Tibet and urge a 10-point appeal. The Speaker in the letter seeks the attention of the honorable delegates and the observers of G20 countries over the pressing issues faced by the Tibetan people under the Chinese Communist regime, and raise the concern over the issues of climate crisis due to the destruction of Tibet's environment, practice of large-scale colonial-style boarding school in Tibet, and the forced mass DNA sample collection in Tibet. The Speaker also congratulated India for holding this year's G20 presidency and all the other members of G20 countries for successfully engaging in the forum. Sikyong Penpa Tsering wrapped up his assessment visit of Tibetan institutions and community in Dharamshala with a visit to the Gyude Monastery on Saturday last week. Abbot Kangkar Tulku Rinpoche led Lama Kangzar Tulku and the monks of the monastery gave a warm welcome reception to the Sikyong and escorted him to the prayer hall, where Sikyong paid obeisance and a tour of the monastery and its departments. From 4 to 7 September, Sikyong embarked on a 4-day assessment visit of Tibetan schools, monasteries and institutions in and around Dharamshala. Kalon of the Department of Information and International Relations launched a book containing a compilation of research articles about the Tibetan Buddhist system of recognizing reincarnations this Thursday morning at the Tibetan Computer Resource Center's auditorium. In his opening remarks, TPiE Director Tsering underscored the indispensability of publishing and circulating such research books to counter China's false assertion. The Compendium of the Tibetan Buddhist Tradition of Reincarnation was published by the Tibet Policy Institute, a think tank and policy analysis institute of the Central Tibetan Administration. Following the book launch, 3 speakers, Namgyal, former Tibetan parliamentarian and incumbent senior professor of College for Higher Tibetan Studies, Sara, Tsangdu Topla, senior lecturer on Tibetan history at the College for Higher Tibetan Studies, Sara, and Nyenthar, lecturer in Tibetan language and literature at Dalai Lama Institute for Higher Education, spoke on topics concerning historical accounts and status of Gandhi Podang government in Tibet. On Wednesday last week, a parliamentary delegation consisting of members of the parliament, Geshe Mölam Tarjin, Lagiri Namgyal Doga, Tsanetsang Tunduptashi and Phupha Doji Geldong met with Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas and other VVIPs at the Open Government Partnership Global Summit 2023. The delegation apprised Prime Minister of Estonia Kaja Kallas a brief introduction of the alarming situation inside of Tibet, 4 schools of Buddhism and PiiE, environmental significance of Tibetan plateau, and so forth. During the sidelines of the event, the delegation interacted with representatives from governments and NGOs from all over the world. The summit was attended by 2,000 participants, including representatives from Tibet, Taiwan, and other 100 countries. Tibetan parliamentary delegation in the last week called on Juku Kale Red, member of Estonian parliament and a Tibet supporter. The members of the parliament also met with officials of e-governance Academy of Estonia. A parliamentary delegation of Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile consisting of parliamentarians Tsering, Dolma, and Penpa Yarpel successfully concluded their Tibet advocacy campaign in Ladakh. On Monday this week, the delegation called on many of the leaders of the UT Ladakh, including the Chief Executive Councillor of UT Ladakh, members of Indian Parliament, member of Minority Commission India, President of Ladakh Buddhist Association, Executive Councillor and Special Welfare Coordinator for Tibetans, former MLA and former members of Indian Parliament. During their meetings, the Tibetan lawmakers advocated support for the just cause of Tibet and presented them with the 10-point appeal letter from the Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile. The Tibetan parliamentary delegation also gave talks at the University of Ladakh on the resolution of the Sino-Tibetan conflict. A group of Taiwanese scholars led by Professor Hung Duen-Yang, former Minister of Science and Technology and Distinguished Professor of the Department of Physics in Chung-Chang University, paid a visit to the Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile and met with Speaker Khenpo Sonam Tempel on Tuesday last week. Welcoming the guest, the speaker shared his brief life's journey after coming into exile, including his monastic education, his shouldering of political responsibility, and so forth. The scholars were taken on a tour of the Parliament Hall and were briefed on the functioning, composition, and evolution of the Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile by the Secretary General Sonam Dorji of the Tibetan Parliamentary Secretariat. Representative Kama Singey, accompanied by Dawa Sangmo, Chinese liaison officer of the Office of Tibet based in Canberra, called on Senator Janet Rice, a long-time supporter of Tibet cause in the Australian Parliament, to extend heartfelt gratitude for her continued support towards the Tibet cause. During their meeting, both discussed some of the next Tibet advocacy works and how Parliament members can continue their support for Tibet cause. Senator Rice has raised the subject of Tibetan struggle numerous times during discussions in the Australian Senate and has recently raised concern over the deteriorating human rights situation in Tibet and the reincarnation of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama on the occasion of the 12th Tibet Lobby Day. Representative Dr. Namgyal Choedup of the Office of Tibet, Washington, D.C. attended the inaugural ceremony of His Holiness the Dalai Lama Library and Learning Center that was established by the Namgyal Monastery Institute of Buddhist Studies in Ithaca, New York on Friday last week. Representative Dr. Namgyal Choedup emphasized on His Holiness the Dalai Lama's commitment to spread the message of oneness of humanity, enhancement of the compassionate nature, and sowing the seeds of a peace in the world. The inaugural ceremony was graced with the presence of Gyabje Kundeling Taksa Rinpoche as a chief guest, along with the other dignitaries, and in attendance of around 400 people. Representative Rigzin Chodron Genka attended the 22nd edition of the Festival of Tibet and Himalayan People that took place from 8 to 10 September in Paris. The festival featured roundtable discussions on Tibet, Buddhism, contemporary Tibetan literature, neuroscience and meditation, poetry reading, book presentations, Tibetan calligraphy, yoga classes, song and dance shows. The festival, organized by Maison de Tibet Cultural Wing of Bureau de Tibet, Paris, was joined by many dignitaries and personalities, and over 6,000 Parisians, Europeans and others came together and discovered the rich culture of Tibet and the Himalayas. With the successful conclusion of festival, Representative Rinzi Chudengenka met with Jean-Louis Romero, Deputy Mayor of Paris, in charge of human rights, integration and fight against discrimination. The representative briefed on the most pressing human rights issues in Tibet. The Deputy Mayor expressed his gravest concern to the worsening situation in Tibet and reaffirmed his commitment to continued support for His Holiness and his people. In 2009, the city of Paris conferred its honorary citizenship upon His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The delegation of Japanese monks representing 9 Sotoshu schools of Japanese Zen Buddhism expressed concern about the worsening situation in Tibet and issued a 7-point joint statement urging China to stop violations of human rights and religious freedom in Tibet. Reverend Hayashi Shui of Jorinji Temple and representatives from 9 temples in Tokyo, Nagano and Ibaraki prefectures visited the liaison office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and handed over the statement to Representative Dr. Arya Tsawangebo. The members of the delegation expressed concern over the continued interference of the Tibetan religious matters by the Chinese government, which is unacceptable to all Buddhists and the international community. On Monday this week, Tibetans in Japan and South Korea and Japanese supporters celebrated the 63rd anniversary of the Tibetan Democracy Day at the Tibet House office. Representative Dr. Arya Tsawangebo talked briefly about the importance of democracy and the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Alumni and Tibetan students studying at the Chiba Institute of Technology pledged to sponsor education of 2 students in India and handed over the initial fund to the Tibet House. Representative Dr. Arya thanked them for their contribution and appreciated their sense of duty toward the community. While Tibetans in Japan and the Japanese supporters attended in person, Tibetans in South Korea attended the celebration online. Deputy Salvador Caro, president of Friends of Tibet in Mexico, visited the Office of Tibet in Taiwan on Monday last week, coinciding his visit to Taiwan at the invitation of the government of Taiwan. Representative Kesa Genzebawa apprised Deputy Salvador Caro of the key roles of the office and discussed wide-ranging topics concerning the Tibet cause and the prevailing situation in Tibet. Representative Kesa Genzebawa also attended the 2-day International Religious Freedom Summit held on 7th and 8th September in Taipei. India-Tibet Coordination Office, in collaboration with the Center for Northeast Asian Studies, Jindal School of International Affairs and OB Jindal Global University, Sonipat, organized a day-long conference on Tibet titled Understanding Tibet in 21st Century on Wednesday this week. ITCO coordinator Thupte Rinzing, in his keynote address, stressed the importance of understanding the relevance of Tibet, especially among the young minds of India. The day-long conference witnessed the participation of speakers such as Dr. Anand Kumar, former professor of Jawaharlal Nehru University and national president of India-Tibet Friendship Society, Author Claude R.P., Tibetologist and distinguished fellow, Center of Excellence for Himalayan Studies, Shiv Nadar Institute of Eminence, Greater Noida, Tenzin Tsundu, Tibetan activist and writer, Dr. Lobsang Yangzo, senior researcher at International Tibet Network, and Thundu Bangmo, research fellow at the Tibet Policy Institute. Aside from the conference, the Tibet Museum from DIR showcased a photo exhibition titled India-Tibet Relations on campus, which was thronged by students and faculties. That is all the news for this week's edition of Tibet This Week. Thank you for watching Tibet TV.